Our speakers today, aside from Szymon Panek, who is from Prague and People in Need, are all members of the NED board, and it's just a terrific board. I'm very, very proud of it, and we really have wonderful people. And the person who is going to be moderating the discussion, Dan Fried, the former ambassador of the United States to Poland, and who really helped shape U.S. policy, NATO enlargement and everything else for Central Europe after the fall of communism. He will moderate. Last night, he presented our tribute to Lech Walesa. I only realized it was a woodcut of the goddess of democracy, and I was reminded, didn't think of it before, but in presenting it, that the June 4th elections in Poland, the critical June 4th elections in Poland, was the same day that the Chinese tanks came in to Tiananmen Square and destroyed the statue of the goddess of democracy, which was now this is what we give as our democracy award. Anyway, Dan will moderate the discussion. And in addition to Szymon, we have George Weigel, who, of course, I think as everyone knows, is the biographer of Pope John Paul II, who was mentioned so much in the discussions before by Lech Walesa, Anne Applebaum, the prolific author, columnist, and Toria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary for Europe in the second Obama administration. We hope that this discussion will be both a discussion among the panelists, but then also involve the audience. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I don't know how I can possibly, or how this panel can possibly follow Lech Walesa and Leszek Balcerowicz. A discussion of these issues seems either difficult or impossible. I also don't know what point there is in my trying to moderate a panel of people who know more about these issues than anybody else, who have their own views. And I gave up long ago trying to moderate anything with Victoria Nuland. Not possible. I think the speakers today were looking back and also looking forward in a way that's helpful, and I want to follow their lead. Looking back, how do we assess the overthrow of communism 30 years ago in the transition? What went right? What went wrong? We heard Leszek Balcerowicz talk about the need for speed. Personally, I think that's right, but there are revisionist takes that suggest that stuff was undone. Could it have been done faster? There have been criticisms made at the time in sense that Poland's transformation was too slow, or it was too fast, or it was both too slow and too fast. It was incomplete. And then looking forward, what lessons are there for us now? I was in Kyiv last month. The Ukrainians I spoke to say they want to follow Poland's path. Can they do it? If they try, is the West capable of helping as much as we helped Poland in the beginning? How about Russia? Is Russia doomed to live down to its worst historical traditions? Leszek Balcerowicz said, it isn't culture, it's not geography, it's policy. Is a set of policies for Russia some future post-Putin government possible? Is it possible for Russia to be better than it is today? And then what Lech Walesa said has relevance in Washington. You know, what went wrong? What are our new challenges? What are the big questions? What conclusion, what did we learn from 30 years ago that is applicable today moving forward? Look, that's how I would frame up the issue. There are other better ways to do it. I want to ask each of the panelists to give like 3 minutes of their take on what we've heard. I've tried to frame things up, but feel free to ignore it, say what you want to say. And very soon afterwards, we'll open up the discussion to the audience, because there are people here who have participated in these events at the time or afterwards. And in this kind of a family setting, so to speak, it would be useful to peer into the fog of the future. So that's my take. And Carl, thank you for the opportunity. And we can start with Tori at that end if you want, or George. Well, or somebody. Or, okay. Anne Applebaum, because you said you would. Your mic is on?
I think my mic is my mic on? Yes.
Okay.
So let me just check, actually. There's on. Okay, now it's on. Yep. So, thank you, Dan. It's always a pleasure to hear Lech Walesa and Leszek Balcerowicz. I've heard them both many times, over 30 years, and they both only get better. So that's. But I think. Sorry, I think. Yeah, thank you, Leszek. I think I would begin by saying, many of you, some of you have read me, and some of you know I will certainly talk about this in a few minutes. There are a lot of problems in Poland right now, and there is in particular problems with the quality of Polish democracy. But before saying that, I would step back and say it's very important to remember that, looking now from a bird's eye view, starting from 1989 to the present, you have to look at Poland and say this was the most successful political transition in the region. It's much more successful than anything that we thought possible at the time. The idea that Poland would be surpassing Portugal and would be moving into the ranks of middle income, sort of middle range rather, European countries, that it would have had a change of power that has been regular and so far, with little minor exceptions, hasn't been challenged. In regular elections following one after the other, that it would develop a sphere of independent media and a sphere of independent associations, that it would have homegrown businesses which now compete at the European level. None of this was even really imaginable in 1989. And so I think any conversation about what went wrong and what went right has to start from that moment. Leszek Balcerowicz was right. What they were confronted with in 1989, in the winter of 89-90, was the total collapse of a completely dysfunctional economy. I was living there at the time. I remember, there was nothing to eat in the stores. It was impossible to get hold of ordinary goods. The idea that you would be able to travel freely across the borders or have any kind of normal exchange with Poland's neighbors was at that time unimaginable. And just to give you a little hint of what the difference is, I have a friend who was trying to describe this era to his son. And he was saying, well, you have to imagine, that there was nothing to buy except vinegar in the shops. And the son looked at him and he said, you mean in all of Tesco, in this huge supermarket, there was nothing but vinegar? This is, the father had to take a few steps back and say, wait, son, actually there was no Tesco. We're in a completely new phase of the economy and of society, and the kinds of problems I think that Poland deals with now are very much the kinds of problems that other mature democracies also deal with. And a lot of what one can say about the quality of Polish democracy, you can also say about American democracy, you can say about French democracy, and and so on. I mean, if we're going to go on to the question of what could have been done differently, I would say that the failure in the 1990s to whether you call it lustration or whether you call it coming to terms with the communist past, whether you call it teaching people history, there was a failure to talk about what the regime had been, how it came to be. Poles, I don't think, even now, my children went to Polish elementary schools. They don't really have in school, they don't learn how communism was imposed. They don't really understand what it was. They don't necessarily understand, therefore, what the dangers of authoritarianism and the return of authoritarianism might be. And so I would say the major failure in the realm of failing to educate people and failing to have some kind of reckoning with communism and with the remaining communists in the country at the time. But I'll stop there, since that's just my introduction.
I would foot stomp the point about how difficult it looked at the beginning.
Yes.
To add that the US government was overwhelmingly skeptical before and halfway through 1989 about the possibility of any change at all in Poland. And when that change happened, that skepticism was replaced by skepticism about the Poles' ability to improve things ever.
Yes.
It was assumed that the Balcerowicz plan and Poland's general free market democratic transformation would fail, and quickly. And there was one prominent cabinet secretary who described Poland as a deadbeat country, and Poland was a country in which we should not invest anything. That was the debate inside the George H.W. Bush administration, and he made the right decisions. And he didn't have to. Most of his cabinet was either opposed or agnostic. But George H.W. Bush wasn't, because he'd been to Poland. And he had met Wałęsa, and he had and Jaruzelski, and had a sense of things. I mention that, and the other thing to mention is that the book in Washington that everybody was reading was Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, which was wonderfully written, thoughtful, deeply historical, and its basic argument was completely dead wrong, which is that the United States is overextended in the world. Yeah, sound familiar? Right? We're overextended, we need to pull back. And he wasn't a right-wing, neo-isolationist, he was kind of center-left, more or less. And it was with that mindset that official Washington greeted 1989. There's a lesson for the future in that somewhere. But the overwhelming skepticism is something that's almost forgotten. So I agree completely with Anne that the current set of problems in Poland or anywhere else are pretty good problems to have.
Well, I don't know if they're good problems, but they're the
a better class.
But they're the problem of an advanced economy and a complex political system, rather than the problems of total failure. Yeah, I would say that.
Well put. Okay. We have any?
Well, perhaps, coming from Czech Republic, let me try to offer a slightly different view. First of all, yes, that's true. United States were completely unprepared. I was a student leader, really scared by special communist militia concentrating in the Czech Republic, in Prague, second day of the student strike, 21st of November 89. So I sent two close friends, one to US Embassy and one to the Soviet Embassy. At the US Embassy, he didn't pass the reception. At the Soviet Embassy, he was from the same faculty, biology, science. He got to the high political secretary in the night, 1 a.m., and returned back to our central strike coordination committee, which was in the heart of the Prague, with a simple message: Mr. Gorbachev will not allow the bloodshed. So it was extremely important for us. I was among the students, 22 years old. I think I was much more optimistic than you. I thought that it will take 10, 15, 20 years to fix the country. Yet economy and political system was more or less fixed, but the people are the same, or a lot of the people, and that's one of the problems. And I would like to be a bit more critical, because in the beginning of 90s we moved to, I would say, extreme liberalism, or to stupid liberalism sometimes, from a very centrally managed economy. And a part of that was feeling that the freedom, superficial democracy and free market will solve everything. Through that, we basically ended in, without the proper rule of law, without the proper regulation, culture, solidarity, inclusive programs in the society. And we ended through 90s in a quite spoiled society with very close ties between the economy, especially big businessmen, which privatize often in a very gray, sometimes immoral ways, the national wealth in alliances with politicians, and those alliances, at least in Czech, are still influencing the politics until now. And it was one of the very deep mistakes. We neglected rule of law, we neglected rules, we rushed for consume and business without really setting the frames. The second was that, and I was part of that, we had a feeling that everyone has the same chances in the life. Since that, my herd is moving much more to the left. So I'm basically getting matured exactly opposite than the well-known slogan, if you are not 18, you are not leftist, you don't have herd. If you are 50 and I'm 50 plus, you don't belong to the liberal conservatives, you don't have brain. Well, I'm probably having both, but trying to somehow combine the things together. But it led up to the fact that a good part of the society in the Czech Republic feel as a losers, not as a winners of the transformation. Maybe it's only 30%, but it's still a lot. And then I agree that we have similar problems with populism coming from an extreme speed of the IT and artificial intelligence changes, geopolitical changes, of course, social media. But at least in Central Europe, I don't really see, and it's not only in Central Europe, some other places are in a similar situation. I don't see enough strong figures which are able to combat the populists. And compared to Western Europe, Czech, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, it's now a better position, but we lack the similarly strong figures which are able to really stand strongly and firmly against the populists, and I think you also know something about that. And that's the problem, in my opinion, that the political elite didn't produce enough strong, true Democrats which are able to be a opponent to the populist in the Central Eastern Europe. So I am more worried. I agree that it's a successful case, but the success and democracy is not for granted for us.
Sure.
So there is a lot of things for which we have to fight, and I think a good part of that comes also from the mistakes which we made during the transformation. Thank you.
I want to elaborate on the notion of relative losers and why they think they're relative losers and the mistakes that you think were made and what can be done now. I mean, I don't, it's a common narrative that there are many people who feel like they're losers. The statistics show that just about every class of society gained.
Yes.
But they didn't gain evenly.
Yeah.
So you have relative winners and relative losers, but in absolute terms, everybody gained, which would not have been possible under communism, where everybody was stagnating. But let's return to this. George, what I wanted to ask you, because we had a discussion earlier, Heiko Maas gave a speech on the occasion of the fall of the Berlin Wall where he was generous in his congratulations of European solidarity from Poland and France and others contributing to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it seemed, what did you think of that? And, did he capture this? Because he was talking about European solidarity and basically the values of the contemporary EU. And everything he said was true, but was it complete?
I thought that Foreign Minister Maas, as well as any number of other commentators in the West, while highlighting certain important, what I would call surface aspects of the revolution of 1989, really missed the human texture of this. And I think to get that, you have to put all of this in an even larger historical frame. The normal 20th century method of effecting great social change was mass violence and enormous bloodshed. I mean, just look through the history of the 20th century. That's how massive social change happened. Anne and I are not trying to hold hands up here. We're just bumping into each other. No scandals, please. That did not happen in the revolution of 1989. So why didn't it happen with the sole exception of Romania? Why was this, in the main, a nonviolent transition, although we remember the martyrs? I mean, the miners of Katowice, the Jerzy Popiełuszko, et cetera, et cetera. Why did this happen? I've been arguing for 27 years that it happened because a revolution of conscience preceded and made possible the political revolution. Joseph Tichenor, Father Tichenor, the chaplain of the First Solidarity Congress in September 1981 in Gdansk, used to refer to solidarity as a great forest planted by awakened consciences. I think that's still a wonderful image, and it's not romantic. I mean, it captures something of the human texture, not just in Poland, and not simply by religiously inspired people, although largely by religiously inspired people. We remember Václav Havel and his colleagues in Czechoslovakia, like Václav Benda, and the phrase living in the truth. We're going to live as if we were free, and that means living in the truth about what? The truth about the human person as made for both freedom and solidarity. Now, you can get to that through a biblical route, Judeo-Christian, or you can get to that by a philosophical route, but that gave this an enormously different human texture. It underwrote what I still think is one of the great one-liners of the revolution of 1989 from a man with whom I have agreed on very little in recent years, but he had it right at one point. And that was Adam Michnik, who said that people who begin by storming Bastilles end up building their own. There was a commitment to do this differently that I think has been missing in a lot of the commentary. I was very happy that President Walesa, who's still wearing his black Madonna, not the goddess of democracy, but the Virgin Mary, mentioned John Paul II, not because he's my guy, and I wrote 2 fat volumes of biography about him, but because I think if you miss his pivotal role in this, you miss this human texture. Because what happened in Poland between June 2nd and June 10th, 1979, really was a question of the history of the 20th century, pivoting in a more humane direction.
This is the Pope's visit.
The Pope's visit, the Pope's first visit. And what did he do? He did not mention politics once. He didn't mention economics once. Aside from the welcoming ceremony at the airport in Warsaw and the farewell ceremony at Balica at the airport in Krakow on the way out, he simply ignored the government as if they didn't exist. And he said to these people in an infinity of variations on one great theme, let me remind you, you are not who they say you are. You are a people formed by a different history and a different culture than this lie that's been told about you for the past 40 years. And if you reclaim the truth about who you are, you will eventually find tools of resistance that communism cannot match, and that, of course, led in 13 months to the rise of solidarity, etc. I think a similar process took place without such a dramatic 9-day period in Czechoslovakia. And that happened again on the Maidan. in Ukraine 4 years ago. So there's something here that we need to attend to in thinking about these questions. And why is that important for today and going forward? I think it's important because democracy to be sustained, markets to be sustained, needs something richer, thicker, nobler than an idea of freedom as, to quote that great moral philosopher Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. If that's the only notion of freedom you've got, there's no possibility of social solidarity. There's no possibility of cooperation between industry and labor. There's no possibility of a politics that doesn't devolve into food fights and worse. So in thinking about this anniversary, I think we need to recover that distinctive human texture of what happened throughout the 1980s rather unexpectedly in order to move forward, because the new phase that we've been talking about really is one, I think, in which questions of the quality of political culture, not simply of institutions, be they political or economic, is going to be paramount, and not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but here as well.
I'm going to ask an uber wonky question, but you're actually qualified to answer it. The encyclical Centesimus annus came out in 1990, I think.
91.
91.
May 1st, 91.
Okay, so you're generally familiar.
Yeah.
Right. It struck me as a kind of updated Catholic social doctrine applicable in particular to a post-communist free market transformation. And, I was always struck by the difference between the Pope John Paul II's reputation in the United States as conservative, given in the spectrum of the American debate, and his actions in Poland, where he was, in the Polish context, a progressive, comfortable with intellectuals and with the modernization of society. And Centesimus annus struck me as a one of these fundamental documents.
Yeah.
Is that right? And did it have an impact? And of course, then later I would love to hear Leszek Balcerowicz on that question, because this has to do with the larger questions you raised and how Poland succeeded as well as it did.
I could talk about that for 45 minutes, but I'm going to try to confine it to 3 minutes. You're absolutely right that this document, for those of you who do not spend your evenings reading papal encyclicals, was a lengthy letter to the world church by John Paul II, reflecting on 100 years of Catholic social teaching, but particularly on the meaning of 1989 and what that portended for the future. It was highly original. The first draft of it, done by the Roman Curia, was kind of a mess. And John Paul gave it to a friend of his, an Italian philosopher whom he trusted, Rocco Buttiglione, and asked him to read it. And Rocco read it and told the Pope, this is just not the way a modern economy or a modern political economy works, and we need a lot more empirical sensitivity here. So the result of that was a massive rewriting of the document, so that in its final form, the Pope talks about 3 interlocking systems in the free and virtuous society of the 21st century. A democratic political community, a market-based economy, or what he preferred to call a free economy, and a vibrant public moral culture that would discipline and direct the enormous human energies that are let loose by free politics and free economics. And in his mind, and I have to say this is true of my own as well, it's the third. It's the public moral culture that's the key to making the other two work properly and interact with each other properly. The problem, as I was saying to Toria and Anne during the coffee break, is that that idea, that body of thought of John Paul II has been received much more fully in the United States than in Poland. There are 70-some Catholic bishops in Poland. My hunch is that maybe 10 of them understand this, and the others are living somewhere in the past. And this is a huge problem that I have tried to address in my own writing in Poland and intend to address next May in Krakow on the centenary of John Paul II's birth. Poland needs to catch up with its greatest hero. It's still looking through the rearview mirror at the great man. It needs to look forward through his eyes, not look back, and it needs to learn his thought.
I wish you luck
Yeah.
in that effort.
Haven't had any so far, but, you know.
Toria, you can ignore me when I put you on the spot as I'm about to do, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Go, baby.
You have personal experience with perhaps the most dramatic high point of Russia's reach for a democratic solution, which was Boris Yeltsin on the tank facing down the communist coup plotters who wanted basically to restore. And I was in Prague the day of the coup, and I remember the Czech communists were openly celebrating in the streets, taunting people, saying, "We're back."
In the streets.
I remember that. I was actually there, and they were, these were individuals celebrating. It was a dangerous moment. But you were in Moscow, and you've had occasion to, I know because we've reflected on ourselves, but you've had occasion to reflect on the challenge of Russia and democracy. And as I said earlier, something Leszek Balcerowicz said this morning struck me. It's not culture, it's not geography, it's actual policy that makes the difference. So, A, what went wrong in Russia? And B, can it be fixed by better policies, or is it something deeper? And there's a debate about this among Russia hands, you know better than I. And feel free to ignore the challenge I just put to you.
Well, thanks, Dan. It's interesting. This is my third 1989 event of the week, and I've found myself thinking about so many of the questions that have already been raised here. But first, for those of us who at that time were working on Soviet issues, as I was in 1989, I was on the Soviet desk trying to encourage perestroika and encourage the reduction of Soviet troops in Central Europe, and we thought that this process with Gorbachev would be glacial, as he did, and as Lech Walesa said this morning. And then in 1991, being on the streets in Moscow, and then working when Clinton came into power to try to support a nascent democratic transition, and failing utterly over the course of the decade. So for us, those of us working on Soviet policy in the US government, Poland was a miracle. Poland was an absolute miracle and was obviously the model, where by 1993 it may not have felt like it to you, but you were clearly, Poland was clearly succeeding at real politics, at an open economy, at integration into Europe. I think it was Minister Balcerowicz who said, or Anne said, real indigenous enterprise that was trying to compete rather than oligarchic capitalism or anything else. And the question is, what was the difference? Was it that in countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, as disappointed as you are, or Czechoslovakia, there was and appropriately, and as we're all worried now about rollback and revanche, that there was historic memory of political liberalism. There had actually been a Renaissance, there was Enlightenment thought, there had been small shops and enterprise and families could remember when they were given the chance to have businesses again, what grandpa's business was like or what their father's business was like. There had been a freer press. Whereas in the Soviet Union, there had been a political coma for some 70 years, and that it was too much to expect. But I found myself thinking, at the time, and we were protagonists in this, of course, but also when you reminded Minister Balcerowicz that your incredible commitment on the economic side to moving fast, that you felt that if that bicycle slowed down, it would fall over. So when it came time to support those in a newly free Russia or Ukraine or anywhere else in the former Soviet space, we took the Polish model, and you remember the great more shock, less therapy. And the result in Russia was the one that we know, that too many people saw their savings evaporate, that the system that emerged was the first really successful oligarchic capitalist model. Were those, and then later, and there was no sense of a richer, denser, more soul-based, unifying identity for Russia. There was more in Ukraine, but they couldn't actually convert. There was certainly in Georgia. I think it was a motivating engine for them. But Yeltsin never could define a Russianness that spoke to the best of the cultural pride, the unifying sense, at the same time that he could encourage and celebrate the diversity of the nation that he had. And then you get Putin, who of course perverts that sense of Russianness and church, etc., to consolidate power. So I was also struck this morning by somebody said, I think it might have been also Minister Balcerowicz, that the greatest threat to democracy, of course, it's obvious, but it bears saying, is the reconcentration of power, whether it's political or whether it's economic. And so when you look at what Putin achieved so swiftly, that's what it was about. It was complete reconcentration of power over 3-4 years, where we sort of thought these were tactical moves. We didn't understand them as a strategic direction until the system had, any chances for the green shoots had completely changed. When we worry about Poland today, it's about that. When you are an elected leader who will not submit to the criticism of a free press, that's because you're concentrating power and you're refusing to have an open debate about the direction of your country. Similarly, when you are challenged and try to roll back a free judiciary, we know this, you are not establishing a level playing field for each individual within the society that they can count on. So when we look at what we worry about in Poland, when we look at what we're worried about in the United States, the same challenges from the top, to a free press, to an independent judiciary, to the diversity that makes us great, all of these things, I think it's important for us to take the lesson that we need to see the rollback for what it is as early as it begins, that it is an effort to reconcentrate power and to be unwilling to share it in any of its manifestations. But I do ask myself whether in a culture that had no Enlightenment experience, that had been politically asleep for 70 years, did we make a mistake? Did the Russians themselves make a mistake? Because obviously we were in support. Should it have been slower? Should it have been more gradual? Or should it in fact have been faster? I just don't know the answer.
I'd like to think that leadership can make the crucial difference. When we look back, we project a retrospective inevitability. Communism was bound to fail. Poland was bound to succeed because it was Western, it had the Enlightenment, the Reformation, not so much the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, it had the Catholic social tradition under it. I mean, there was a moral fundament. Of course, at the time, nobody thought the success was inevitable. Poland was bound to fail for age-old cultural reasons, which means if culture was made success and failure inevitable, depending on your starting point, it's probably not culture. But at the same time, Victoria, you're right about we underestimated, or at least I underestimated, the difference between post-Soviet and post-communist. And I remember in '89, Goremek said in Washington when he came in the spring, I remember what a normal Poland looked like. I was a kid, but I remember elections and newspapers in a European country. We all want it back. We want that country back.
Right.
And it wasn't living memory in the Soviet Union. Baltics, yeah, a little bit in Western Ukraine, but basically not, and not in Russia. So I don't have an answer.
But at the same time, sorry, just to say that, you know, I stood among those crowds of 250,000 people around the Russian White House in the summer of 1991, and they were every age, and they wanted what Poland already had. And then somewhere along the line, probably in the economic hardship that followed, democracy becomes a dirty word. You know?
So it could be, with different policies and different leaders, it might have been different. I mean, I don't know.
So can I say, I think the big difference between Poland and Russia, I mean, aside from the many obvious differences, the difference that mattered at this stage in history was that Poland had something that Russia didn't have, which was an alternative elite. In other words, when communism fell, there were people like Leszek, you know, there were people like Michnik, there were people like Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who had thought about what it meant to run a country or transform an economy, and were somehow ready to take over and step in, and that, you know, and it's almost, you know, I really always dislike these arguments from culture or history. You know, if we believe that every country was condemned never to change, you know, then Great Britain would still be an absolutist monarchy, you know, and I don't know, France would still be run by someone like Louis XIV. So in other words, countries do change, and they evolve, and they shift all the time. And I also still believe that it would have been possible for Russia to change. Remember that Russia never had the kind of economic reform that Poland had, and Russia never had any, you know, there was no real experiment with democracy that ever happened. Again, you know, there'll be other economists in the room who can talk about it. I mean, the word democracy in Russia became undermined before it had ever had any effect. In other words, there was no small level capitalism. There was no legal basis for an economy created. There was no, you know, redistribution of private property that made sense. There was never anything that resembled Western capitalism. Russia's never had that, and so the idea that, you know, it somehow failed in Russia because it had to fail. Well, it wasn't tried, at least not to the extent that it was tried in Poland. I mean, just as one other point, it's very interesting that in Poland right now, those who are assaulting the basis of democracy in Poland, and I very much do believe, I think as also Leszek said, that one of the fundamental things that you have in Poland that you didn't have in Russia was the rule of law and an independent court system that was created very quickly. Those who are assaulting that court system in Poland now also are trying to write Lech Walesa out of history. And trying to write Tadeusz Mazowiecki. So everything that we're talking about here today, all the people who we're celebrating and remembering as great and brave and who did these marvelous things, are persona non grata in Warsaw, at least in government circles. Because we now have a ruling party in Poland that seeks to undermine the very basis of that success. In other words, that alternative elite that, you know, that thought, that cared so much about creating the rule of law, that cared so much about creating the fundamental basis for the change. That's now, you know, there's now an effort to rewrite history, eliminate them, and create a different kind of Poland that's based on a, you know, essentially would be a one-party state. And it's not an accident that the ideals of 1989 are being undermined by a current government that has a very different set of intentions.
if you're right about Russia not having in 1991 an alternative educated class that was ready to take over and provide
and that had
alternatives.
already
Yeah.
functioned as a political group, already had been publishing newspapers, as you had in Poland.
Right.
Is it-
If that was true then, well, it certainly was true then, conditions even in Putin's Russia are more, analogies are weak, but you could compare them to the degree of freedom in Russia today is like the degree of freedom in some respects to communist Poland. That is, there is some space for independent, if limited, print media. Some people can travel. Yeah, very small, but remember, I'm comparing it to communist Poland. And under those circumstances of communist Poland, there was a whole network, there was a whole world of non-communist intellectuals who were, Leszek, you were talking about preparing a new economic plan as a hobby because, what else were you going to do with your time? There were people like that all over, thinking about strategies, and the governments, the many governments after '89, all had people to tap into. I just want to throw it out that it is possible that those alternative cadres may exist in Russia
in Russia now.
Now, not then. Now.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Look, I mean, I think you're right that Russia had not had the 10 years of ferment and conversation, and they certainly hadn't had a workers' movement. But there was a thin but highly educated and highly ready to work with the West set of leaders, the Gaidars and Kozyrevs and Chubaises and Yavlinskys and all of those guys who tried. I think that it's possible that there wasn't, the collapse of the economy happened so fast and so viciously that it was very, very hard for the green shoots to sort of start to grow. And then the question becomes, as you said rightly, Anne, there was really no alternation of power that happened properly. There was no. But I think fundamentally, the system of state control was much more vast, much more entrenched versus a Polish system which had depended on the Soviet overlay to keep it, in power. So I do think that there are interesting parallels now where you have dissatisfied workers around Russia who are striking that in ways that were similar to the early 80s Poland. You have younger people who think that, as compared to the generation of 30-year-olds who think that somehow they're not European enough. So you have lots of new pockets of dissatisfaction in Russia, but whether they will coalesce in this way, it's hard to imagine.
I hadn't thought of this until we were talking about this a moment ago, but it's interesting. You have two martyr priests within 7 years of each other. Jerzy Popiełuszko in Poland is murdered by the SB, and yet the movement goes on and in fact accelerates out of that. The one figure in Russia who might have made a difference, Father Alexander Men, a non-xenophobic, non-nationalist, not chaplain to the Tsar, Russian Orthodox priest, is murdered in 1990, axe-murdered in a forest. And any hope of an alternative definition of Russianness that has a basis in a long standing Orthodox culture goes. Because whether he was murdered by Russian Orthodox officials or the KGB or the two of them working together, the fact is you were back to that there was no alternative. When Yeltsin is looking for some definition of Russianness, The Russian Orthodox Church can't provide that because it has been the chaplain to the Tsar, and its leadership has been a wholly owned subsidiary of the KGB since the Second World War. That makes a difference. It might not have made a decisive difference, but you have two examples of guys who are trying to point a different future. They're both murdered. They're both martyrs. There's a different outcome in each situation because the fundamental circumstance, cultural circumstance, historical circumstance, was different, and that remains, I think, a huge problem in Russia today. There is no historically grounded alternative definition of what it means to be Russian than this line that Putin has been selling, evidently with some effect. And that's a
But
huge
his
obstacle to the
definition of
future.
Russianness depends on the concentration of power.
Absolutely,
goes
but that's
back
true
to
historically
Tsar-
since Peter the Great.
Right.
I mean, that's not an invention of Putin.
Right.
It struck me at the time, in the early 90s in Poland, and has struck me periodically ever since, that Poles acted then, in the worst part of the transformation, according to their best traditions and beliefs about their best traditions. That is, a feeling about the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and a constitutional monarchy, tradition of religious tolerance, the liberal constitution of the 3rd of May, the multinational ethos of the 1863 uprising, the slogan for your freedom and ours of the January uprising, I had the sense in the early 90s that Poles from right to left associated with solidarity, but even more broadly, insisted that they would live according to their best national narrative. They would say, as if they were saying to themselves, we really are a people of democratic values, of tolerance, of democracy, and we're going to live that way. And it worked. I mean, you can argue, every nation, and being an American, I am acutely aware of this these days, has the dark side of its history, the dark side of its national character, and we Americans are confronted with this on a regular basis, I am not happy to say. But you can choose to live according to your best traditions. And the Poles did, and I think that narrative carried them forth, because it might have been otherwise. Now, I realize I'm straying into your territory.
No, but what Anne is saying is absolutely
right. There are moral underpinnings.
This is what the present government is trying to deconstruct.
Right.
It doesn't want to remember the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It doesn't want to remember what the image that John Paul II lifted up of a pluralistic Poland that he inherited from his father, the Pilsudski tradition, as distinguished from the Dmowski tradition. And this is why there has to be pushback against this false narrative that reads Wałęsa and Mazowiecki and Geremek and Professor Balcerowicz out of the story, substituting a false picture of the past.
And for Russians, the question is, can such a narrative be constructed? The Russian liberal tradition, it exists. I mean, the Decembrists, Herzen,
We could be celebrating
Tolstoy.
it.
Yeah. And
Right.
in fact, Yeltsin,
Andrei Sakharov.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think and Yeltsin had some great speeches along these lines in 93, 94, 95. He just couldn't create the living community to support it, and he didn't get, and then the politics of 96 get in the way, which is a whole nother lunch.
He also became ill. I mean,
No, he was not healthy enough to do it. He didn't become ill. He was always ill.
Yeah,
right.
the
exactly.
what ifs.
Yeah,
He was
exactly.
ill.
Yep.
Look, I promised to open this up. and I want to give the first opportunity to Leszek Balcerowicz, who has had to sit and listen to, to non-Poles talk about stuff that you, one, lived through, and two, made happen. So, sorry about that.
But can I ask him a question before he asks us a question?
We have two.
Should Russia have gone faster or slower?
But anything you want, and then open it up, but I thought it was only decent to give Leszek the floor.
Well, thank you very much for this favor. First, there are many theories about why communists collapsed, socialists collapsed. And we are looking for different factors, including the role of John Paul II. But this is very speculative. I am not denying that it's likely, but you can have it very difficult to prove. And there are some other factors. Terrible economic weakness of socialism because of socialism. In Poland, why did solidarity was crushed and was very weak? But there was a continuing economic weakness in Poland, which has led Jaruzelski to the conclusion either there would be more repression, for which he was not willing, fortunately, or there has to be some accommodation. And this is the origin of the talks around the round table, where the end was very different from the beginning. Remember, in history, we have chance factors. So nobody expected what would be the result of the round table discussion and what would be the results of this result. And this has led to the Mazowiecki government after. But without the terrible economic weakness, there would be no willingness of the part of communist authorities to try to accumulate. To some extent, the same story applies to Gorbachev.
Yep.
I think he was an exceptional authority, and I think he defined victory not necessarily as a victory of communism. So his Nobel Prize is well deserved, because he could have tried to use more repression. He didn't, but one very important factor was a terrible economic weakness of socialism because of socialism in the then for Soviet Union. They were extremely dependent on imports of grain. Well, from the United States, they were threatened by the prospect of hunger. So in certain sense, socialism has undermined itself, but it could have continued for a longer time if there were people more willing to use repression, more repression. So this was the first point. So we should first look in trying to explain major systemic changes to the more tangible factors, which can be proved, and then to less tangible. And you remember, besides views, incentives matter. So if you want to change the people's behavior in terms of economic, which is very important, you have to change incentives in a radical way. So you dissolve socialism and introduce market competition. Okay, so this is the first point. The second point, there was the role of Catholic Church in Poland's transition, very big factor. Let me only say from my own experience that initially I was afraid that they could be critical, the bishops of this initial program, referring to the traditional social teaching of the church. And this is why I visited the Pope in late, I think, 1990. The official reason was to talk about debt reduction and to convince him to, and he was very much in favor. But besides, I wanted to present to him my view on the economic transformation. I don't know whether it was needed or not, but the fact is that the Polish church has not been critical of the initial transformation for the first 2 or 3 years. They were even more supportive. I remember the primus, Primate Glemp, who said, among those unemployed are people who don't want to work. That was very encouraging. So, the third point, and this is a huge subject, Poland and Russia. Right. Now, I think, again, there are certain more tangible factors that the differences in culture. I do not deny that culture matters, but it requires a lot of research effort to prove it. Now first, Gaida, there was an alternative, to some extent, an alternative group. It was Gaida. They were even younger than I was at that time, and there was a Gaida group. They moved in the same direction, and I think they have to. You had to free prices. If you want to move of anything in the economy, they did it, but there were two differences. First, they have less time than we had because of political developments in Russia. Second, the worst consequences appeared after they were replaced by non-reformers,
Yeah.
including the terrible fiscal crisis. But this was blamed upon Gaida Group. Third, they were ill-advised by International Monetary Fund to keep the ruble zone, which meant there were several central banks which were competing with printing money. And this is why they had even worse hyperinflation than we did. There was a terrible fundamental policy error due because of IMF. And finally, oligarchs. If you liberalize the economy initially, which is necessary, but you inherit 90% of the state sector, it is very difficult to avoid shabby deals between state enterprise directors and private. And it was already under Gorbachev, when he finally let economy liberalize and to create private enterprises, but it was in the presence of this not dominated state sector, unavoidably. And there were many opportunities for lucrative deals. So you could create a private enterprise and use transfer prices from the enterprise. There was the origin of the oligarchs,
It's interesting.
including Khodorkovsky.
Yeah.
I am not blaming them. And there was not part-time nomenclatura. There were clever people from Komsomol, mostly mathematicians and physicists, because they are usually good minds. Now, how have you avoided in Poland? I think we've stressed very much this danger. There were very important members of our group who were very watchful. There was a prospect of quick privatization with the possibilities for the enterprise directors to participate in that. And the third factor, which is specific for Poland, was there was solidarity. Lech Walesa solidarity, which was present in the state-owned enterprises and was watching and monitoring what is going on and minimizing the danger of these this is why we avoided oligarchs. And also we started from universal rules. For me, good policies was universal and not specific branch by branch, because this invited corruption, and this invited, etc. So I think Russia's reformers are unjustly blamed. They are my younger colleagues, but I am defending their record not because they are younger colleagues, but because they are unjustly blamed. And what was happened, perhaps, there will be nice surprises. I am, very good Russians are very good, really. They are very courageous because they have to take much larger risks.
Yes.
And they're amazingly good as people, as persons, and we never know what will happen. Thank you.
Another important point is that Poland was blessed with not having oil and gas. It's like really, it was a
Absolutely.
great, great blessing.
Right.
Can I just throw one more thing in here? Economic situation in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s was terrible. Wheelbarrows full of marks. That produced brown shirts. Economic situation in Poland was terrible, and that produced solidarity. The answer to the why, the difference, cannot be simply an economic answer. Yeah, no, I'm sure you aren't, but I think that, that clarifies the importance of national history, an understanding, a different narrative, as Dan was pointing out. It's not just a question of how bad the inflation rate is, and Tesco doesn't exist, and vinegar's the only thing on the store shelves. Another thing, I just mentioned this in terms of recovering the human texture. I have been teaching in Krakow every summer for almost 30 years now. And about 20 years ago, my dear friend, Father Richard John Newhouse, who would very much enjoy being part of this conversation, asked some of our Polish students, why is there no great literature, poems, plays, novels, about the communist period? There's this huge literature about the Holocaust and how important that is to keeping alive the memory of the victims, and as a warning against the recrudescence of Nazism. Why is there no literature about the communist period? And there was dead silence. We're sitting out on the Rynek Główny in Krakow drinking beer. There's dead silence among these Polish kids. And then one of them says, we don't want to remember the times when our grandmothers collected coins in toilets, in public toilets. To which Father Richard replied, that is precisely why you need to write about them. It's those people whose endurance, whose commitment to their families, whose commitment to a better narrative of Poland helped make the transition possible. So what Anne's saying is absolutely true, that there is no real teaching of that story, and therefore people forget. And that's a terrible thing, to forget what people endured and came out of on the far side with a moment of great heroism and decency.
Well, we're here to remember and look ahead, but I promised to open it up to questions. So, yeah, and do we have a microphone? Okay.
A couple observations
Oh, and
leading
just
to
identify yourself for everybody.
Adrian Karatnitsky with the Atlantic Council. A couple observations leading to a question. Since we are at the National Endowment for Democracy, whose purpose is to support democratic forces and then democratic transitions, I think it's important to re-inject the role that the United States initially played in the transition. The coherence of solidarity in the underground was as a result of financing that came both through the Catholic Church and through various operations that were being conducted from the outside, many of them supported by the trade union movement, by the National Endowment for Democracy. That allowed this elite that that Anne has mentioned to develop, to have a debate within itself, et cetera, et cetera. Second point about the vision of George H.W. Bush. Lane Kirkland, whose name was invoked before, I accompanied Lane Kirkland to a meeting in the Longworth building where across from us sat Tom Foley, Dan Rostenkowski, John Dingell, and David Obey. Lane Kirkland said the Bush administration is proposing to give $5 million for the Polish transition. This is a historical event. This is pissant, as he put it in his deep baritone timbre. And sitting on the other side were the Pole John Dingell, the Pole Dan Rostenkowski, and David Obey, whose constituency had one of the two Polish newspapers that were regularly being produced. So I think it's important, because it is the NED and because it is the United States, these issues don't often any longer enter into our memories. But that level of commitment, that level of support, then the pressure within the Club of Paris, the Club of Rome, getting the IMF and both private donors to reduce the burden of the Polish debt. All that kind of diplomacy was also helping people like Deputy Prime Minister Balcerowicz to at least have a less critical environment. And the mistake, I can't speak to Russia, but the mistake that bedeviled Ukraine was that the US, until Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, was freezing any substantial support for Ukraine's initial transition. It may not have made a difference, but it clearly was starving Ukraine in the initial year and a half, until they agreed to transfer their weapons to Russia. So my intervention is only to the point to add to the idea that there is a factor of US leadership, there is a factor of the granular US engagement of both US society and of the US policy elite.
Can I, just to make one comment to that, once you move beyond 89, 90, 91, it's really clear that the success of the Polish transition and also the Czech transition and the Slovak transition and the Central European transition in general are almost unthinkable without NATO expansion and without EU expansion, because the rules that were set by NATO, what you have to do in order to get in, the stages you have to pass. This applies more to democracy than to economics, but and even more so the EU. And these are countries that had an idea that they wanted to be normal. They wanted to be normal European countries, and that meant being part of European institutions. And there was a path set out. There's a series of changes you have to make to your political system in order to qualify to be part of these institutions. And this was transformative in its importance, not so much in the early period, but as the 90s went on and into the early 2000s. I mean, you can't really imagine democratization having the success that it did without those, I would say both of those offers. And the NATO one was extremely important psychologically. The idea that there would be this sphere of safety, that it was therefore safe to invest in that region, that therefore it was safe to travel back and forth, that there weren't going to be any border changes, that there wasn't going to be a Russian or any other kind of invasion. This was a really, really important kind of and this was an amazingly generous and important American gesture to the region that was there. So I'm agreeing with you that even aside from the money donated and so on and the work that Ned did at that time and later, you also had this security guarantee that was absolutely transformative. And it gave 100 million people, literally, who had been part of a region of the world that was the origin of two great world wars, really. It gave them this sense of security and this period of peace that made the transition possible.
I was involved in the NATO enlargement policy in the Clinton administration. So,
You were the father of it, Dan.
well,
Mr. Modesty
I've
down
been
there.
so I've been accused. But Anne is right, but there are two things to add. Those of us involved in that policy, and I'm thinking of Ron Asmus especially, were aware of our responsibility to generate the policy-making generation that I was in. We were responsible for not screwing it up again, by which we understood we could not reaffirm the Yalta line in Europe and then force that upon the Poles when they had overthrown the first Yalta. We weren't going to reward them by imposing a second one. We were aware, and we were speaking in those terms among ourselves, not exactly putting it in our memos. But that's how we thought. Secondly, everything that Anne is talking about is right, but the political capital we could deploy on behalf of Poland, Czech Republic, later Slovakia, Hungary, and NATO enlargement generally was generated by those people themselves. Okay, by the mid-90s, as people have said, Poland is not only a success, it's known to be a success. Everybody loves a winner. And so Poland was amassing enormous political capital and used it. Gremick told me once that Poland took the political capital of liberation and invested it in the economy. So gave it to Leszek Balcerowicz, which gave you the time for the reforms to work. Then Lech Walesa takes that increased political capital, right? Political capital of liberation, plus the extra amassed political capital of success, and uses it to beat up Bill Clinton on NATO enlargement, and was quite successful. He and Václav Havel flipped Clinton, basically, in January '94. Rather different styles, as you can imagine. He said exactly the same thing, which is, we have a window of opportunity to build a united Europe, which you say you want, but your weak Partnership for Peace will not do it. NATO enlargement will. And Clinton came out of those meetings knowing that he was not going to sell to anybody anything short of NATO enlargement under conditions. And so what Anne is talking about is absolutely right. We put in the conditionality, but to get there, we had to have agreement on the goal. So NATO enlargement was organically part of 1989, because by God, we were not going to recreate Yalta. Now, this was...
I mean, you can also argue that the absence of similar thinking about Ukraine and the rest of the post-Soviet space explains some of the problem in that region.
Oh,
today.
Well, in Central
Yeah.
Europe, in Poland, in Czech, one of the kind of a guiding principles was we want to be back part of the West.
yeah.
And I mean, in Moscow, they never say we want to be part of the West because they were never part of the West.
Some
That's
of them,
right.
some of them
And
did.
that's
Some
a-
of them did. Some of them
Yeah,
do.
some people do, but the country was never integral part of the, let's say, Western Europe, of the Franco-German part of the civilization. So for us to return back to Europe was basically the plan for the 10, 15 years. And as Anne mentioned, then we were ready to, and our politicians at that time, they were ready to adopt a lot of things which they partially dislike, at least some of them, but they were pushed to do it. So for us, the getting membership in NATO and accessing EU was a real 15 years long roadmap.
Yes.
And you don't have anything like that now available. So that's also for
Yeah.
Central Europe part of the maybe a bit of the disorientation, because it was a clear long-term foreign policy, but also internal reform plan, and it's missing.
And there was a consensus around it
Yes,
in
there was
almost
a
every country.
base consensus. I would
on,
say
on the contrary, you've got
80% people
Yeah.
there.
Yep. I wish we could offer Ukraine the same deal, but more questions, because I promise. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Amira Ismail. I'm Poland desk officer at the State Department. This is a fantastic discussion, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to share your insights with us. My question is more forward-leaning. We've been talking a lot about the past and looking backward, but looking forward, I'd love to hear your comments on your SWOT, or your strategic, or what is it, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threat analysis or forecast, looking ahead at the current and future relationship between the United States and Poland, and with Central European countries more broadly. Thank you.
An easy question. 30 years ago, I had your job. Okay? Like, best job ever. In 1989? Yeah. All right, who wants to take on U.S.-Polish relations? Yeah,
Am I allowed to say it depends?
Yeah, right.
sure.
Look, there will never be a Polish government that will be critical of the U.S. In other words, Poland sees itself as having a special alliance with the United States, and I think we'll always, I can't imagine any future Polish government breaking that up, regardless of who the American president is and regardless of what U.S. policy is. So that's a kind of fundamental piece of it. But the rest of the relationship is now almost entirely, I think, framed by what happens to NATO. Poland is a fierce supporter of NATO. It sees its security dependent on NATO. We're not going to beat around the bush here and pretend that the current administration feels the same way about NATO as previous administrations. And if in a second Trump administration, or even in a future presidential administration, we can't imagine the United States backs away from or hedges about its relationship with NATO, then I think the relationship is in a serious crisis. I mean, Poland is dependent on the U.S. In my view, over-dependent, but it should have but it is dependent on the U.S. for its security, and the U.S. is thinking about whether it wants to go on providing security to that part of the world, and that's the frame through which the relationship will be seen.
I think the Polish government has handled the Trump administration with skill and I give credit to President Duda. I mean, I have some knowledge of this. And I also sense from I spent 2 weeks in Poland last month, and I have a sense that even the Polish government that feels ideologically aligned with some parts of the Trump administration is beginning to recognize the value in let us say, broadening its ties in the West. You know, a ceasefire with the Germans, rhetorical ceasefire with the Germans, maybe thinking about reaching out to France, not fighting so much with the EU. We'll see. And you know, I'm not trying to predict something much better, but I wanted to say something positive about the prospects for Poland's relations with the West if they draw the right conclusions. You know, I think Anne framed it up correctly. Poland's security depends on the United States, but Poland should not allow the United States to have a monopoly of its relations with the West. Bad idea. And build from there. But
the danger is that Poland like everybody else, may have to choose at some point between the United States and Europe. And that's a kind of nightmare, but it may happen.
Right.
I think a lot of it depends on internal developments in Poland. I am not persuaded that the present government and what it represents survives Mr. Kaczynski leaving the scene. I think the whole thing
might not even survive. Yeah, may even be shorter than that.
So that suggests that, you know, one of the things that I have thought for 20 years Poland badly needs is the evolution of a Burkean liberal conservatism in conversation with a center left. That has not happened, and that opened the door to this nationalist, xenophobic, Demovskyite business. And that's got to be built. I mean, that center-right alternative has got to be built, because if it's not there, the vacuum is going to be filled by the kind of stuff that's been filling it in recent years. But I think a lot of this, completely agree on the NATO side, but Poles have got to take hold of the political cultural situation themselves and develop an alternative center-right position to what peace represents.
More questions? Yes, sir.
My name is John Shalin. I'm with the National Data Reserve. Can you collectively speak to the implications of the Nord Stream gas pipeline for both Polish domestic and international relations?
No.
I'm
I can, but I'll let Toria do it.
Look, I think Poland has very smartly diversified its own energy mix, especially as it takes in builds more LNG terminals, interconnects with Northern Europe and with the Balts. You know, that's a different matter than the historic mistake of the EU not being even stronger in terms of its landmass becoming more dependent on Russian gas. I mean, they've done their best through EU regulation and through member state gumming up the works to slow things down. So Poland has it right. I mean, my answer to the previous question would link to this, which is as one of the economies that is still growing strongly, as one of the better innovation bases in the east and central and east of Europe, as a country that until the last couple of years of serious Kaczynski-style rollback, the west part of Europe was really starting to listen to as a partner, not just on security, but also on economic and industrial policy. You know, I think a Poland that stands up for free economies, for more liberalism, for more openness, and starts to defend those things will have a stronger voice in Europe and will be in a better position vis-a-vis us. I worry that the two great institutions that created the Poland of today, along with the Polish people or in partnership with the Polish people, NATO and the EU, are actually enablers now of democratic backsliding, and that's part of the failure of US leadership in Europe, not having that conversation with big EU about cohesion funds, enabling proto-autocrats to destroy politics and buy votes, whether it's in Hungary or whether it's in Poland or anywhere else. And NATO, once you get in, having no mechanism for continuing to measure and encourage democratic prosperity. So, you know, I am somebody who believes we should have a permanent NATO presence in the East, and it should probably be based in Poland. But I would not give a Fort Trump or a Fort Elizabeth Warren unless we were back to the basics that allowed Poland to get into NATO in the first place.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Benjamin Kim. I'm a foreign area officer in the United States Army. Just a little nervous right now to be talking to the people whose works I've read or read about. But I'll try to forego too much preamble, since I'm sure your experience with Poland is much greater than mine is. I have 3 questions that I'd like to get responses from. One, from a historical perspective, I noticed that in your invocations about Polish history and trying to compare that to Russia, no one really is talking about stan wojenny, the state of martial law that happened in 1981. And I was hoping that you guys could, or some of you could, please comment on the psychological impact that had on Poles and their view of communism in Poland, or socialism in Poland. 2, looking at the contemporaneous speeches, comments, notes that were written during the course of Solidarity, I personally came to the conclusion that Solidarity was actually a movement based on an illiberal foundation, that it was an argument for the Polish ruling government to return to its mandate to protect the workers, and that it was in fact an exposure of kind of the hypocrisy of the socialist movement in Poland that Solidarity was trying to point out to, and that, you know, people like Jarosław Kaczynski and his brother Macierewicz, all of these people were people that were part of the Round Table in Solidarity. That they were not outsiders at the time, and that and so that. Third question, going to this idea of NATO expansion in the 1990s and this policy. While I do agree that you know, it was an excellent carrot for trying to get newly liberalized countries to come into the European and Western fold, I would like to ask you guys to respond to the whole Baker comment of not 1 inch to the east that was given to Gorbachev during the German reunification talks, and also how Russia viewed this NATO expansion as kind of a way around this argument that instead of advancing NATO forces to the east, will just subsume all of the former Warsaw Pact countries.
All right.
30 seconds.
Okay. On NATO enlargement, that is an urban myth. Baker's comment to Gorbachev about not 1 inch to the east had to do with stationing of forces inside East Germany. And there's a lot of evidence to that effect, but don't take my word for it. Ask Gorbachev. He already said that debunked this theory,
And
that
Baker.
we promised no enlargement.
Baker.
Yeah. Secondly, Solidarity is illiberal. It might have been, but it didn't turn out that way. I mean, you have Lech Walesa, leader of Solidarity, Gdansk shipyards, with Leszek Balcerowicz, you know, traveling together, joint appearances. Walesa used his political capital to back Balcerowicz at considerable political cost to himself, because he knew that this was right, that you couldn't continue Soviet-style economies, you know, in perpetuity. And finally, on martial law, you know, I think
It was a downer.
yeah, right. No, that's all you need
People
to
knew
say.
communism was bad before martial law. I mean,
Okay,
come on,
that's
what is
it.
this? This was just simply the icing on the cake.
Although, you know, there's a funny Adam Michnik story about martial law. And martial law really was a hideous period in Polish history. Those of you who know it know, you know, you just stand in queues. Everybody remembers standing in queues for baby milk or whatever. It was really awful. And as a sort of reflection on it, Michnik once said, but we were so young then. You know, you can be nostalgic for anything.
All right. Look, this is, I'm afraid we're out of time, and I apologize for that. There are a lot of good questions, but it is my honor to participate in this event, given the history, and a pleasure to be on a panel with people who, have lived this along with me, since I had hair. So thank you all for coming.